I'm very happy to be here. See, I grew up here in northern Thailand, in Chiang Mai, in a house along the river. And I remember as a child seeing the waters of the river rise and sometimes overflow their banks. This is a picture of my father and little sister in front of our home in Chiang Mai. As you can see, sometimes it would flood, and luckily they brought an umbrella to stay dry. And these types of events were quite regular growing up. And for me, they brought inspiration to pursue the field that I now focus on in my career in disaster risk management. Many of you in the audience probably experienced the historic floods that happened in Chiang Mai last year. My parents' home was spared, but some of the neighbors and some of the communities in Chiang Mai were devastated. Disasters have a way of making us feel small and powerless, as if we're at the mercy of forces much greater than us. And in fact, that's embedded in the words itself. The word disaster, its etymology, comes from a misfortune fated from the stars. It's a very beautiful and powerful word, but it's also very misleading. It suggests that there's little that we can do against these catastrophes. And that's what I want to talk about with you today. How, with better understanding of risk, we can start seeing the bends ahead of the river and perhaps steer towards a safer place. So first off, what is risk? So in the field of risk analysis and risk modeling, we define risk as the combination of these three elements: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. The hazards are the extreme events. Those are the floods, the tropical cyclones, the earthquakes, the landslides. And we want to understand how intense they might be and how frequently they occur. Exposure describes what's in the path of those hazards. So those are our homes, our infrastructure, our roads, our people that might be impacted by these hazards. And finally, vulnerability describes the fragility or resilience. You can start seeing why this framework might help us understand risk. If you have a major flood in the middle of an empty field, that might not cause very much risk because there's no one there to be impacted. But a much smaller flood in a vulnerable urban environment might cause catastrophe. And true disasters happen when all three of these things are aligned. And this type of thinking around risk as this intersection of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, the combination of the probability of something happening and the consequence of those events, is something that we do naturally every day. This morning when you came here, or this afternoon perhaps, you might have looked at the sky and asked yourselves, do I need an umbrella? If the sky was cloudy, you might have assessed that the hazard is high, the probability of rain is high, so you might bring an umbrella. But perhaps even if the sky is clear, you're going to an important interview and you need to make sure you look your best. And so you still bring the umbrella because the consequences of getting there wet are too high. That's an example of this balance between probability and consequence that you do every day automatically. And we tend to be quite good at this for things that we're familiar with, like whether or not it might rain, when to cross the road safely. We're not so good at it for extreme events, very rare events that we might have never experienced before, or for very complex things like climate change. For those things, we need different tools, but we can still rely on this framework. So let me give an example. Let's say that you're a hotel owner and you own this hotel along the river. That describes your exposure, these three buildings. Now you run a flood model and you discover that about every 5 years, you can expect half a meter of flooding. And every 10 years, you might expect a full meter of flooding. every 50 years, 2 meters of flooding. That describes your hazard. It describes the intensity of the hazard, of the flood, and the probability of it occurring. Now, what about vulnerability? Well, you do an analysis and you discover that with 0.5 meter of flooding, the lobby is flooded, and you'll lose about 2 weeks of revenue. With 1 meter of flooding, you need to close down for 1 month in order to manage repairs. And then with 2 meters, that causes significant damage, and you'll have to close for a full 6 months. So you can see by combining hazard exposure and vulnerability, you now have a view of your risk in quantitative terms, in financial terms or operational terms. That makes it actionable. And you can do this not only for current climate, but also for future climate. The problem is that by and large, we don't have access to this information. Historically, the only people who have really had access to this information are insurance companies, and only in wealthy countries. But most people around the world don't have access to this type of information. In fact, this type of information hasn't existed. So that's specifically what we've been trying to address in my lab at NTU and spin-off company, Ventrix. We develop high-resolution risk models that cover the entire world, every coastline, every river basin, and not only for flooding, also tropical cyclones, extreme heat, and more. We combine artificial intelligence and remote sensing in order to develop very accurate data sets about our environment, about our landscape. For instance, we need a very high-resolution and accurate topography model in order to understand flooding and how water will flow over our landscape. We develop physics-based models to then simulate extreme events like floods, like tropical cyclones, like heat waves. And then we can propagate that to impacts on our exposure using vulnerability models so that we can quantify the expected damage that these events will cause and the cost that it will take to repair. Ultimately, our goal is to arm every decision maker with the tools of foresight of risk so that they can start making decisions that are informed by an understanding of risk. See, part of the power of this framework is not only to quantify the problem, but to help us find solutions. On the hazard side, it is true that it's often hard to control. There's very little that a city like Manila or even Miami can do to prevent tropical cyclones and hurricanes. But what about exposure and vulnerability? Those are much more in our control. And remember, risk is defined not by the hazard alone, but by the combination of these three things. So there's a lot we can do. This hotel along the river, what if we had built it slightly away from the floodplain, or raised it up above the ground, or perhaps even just moved the critical assets within to higher floors? How would that have transformed the risk of that hotel? We can quantify that. We can calculate the money saved, the injuries avoided, the lives saved using these tools. And that's very powerful. And in fact, we can go beyond that. We shouldn't think about resilience only in terms of avoided losses, but also of the value that it can create. Let's travel now to Boston in the 1800s. At that time, much of Boston consisted of salt marshes. They were dirty, they were smelly, they flooded all the time. Believe it or not, the city of Boston experienced outbreaks of malaria and cholera. So what did they do? They invited Frederick Law Olmsted. He had designed Central Park in New York. And his solution wasn't pipes and walls, but instead he rechanneled the river through a collection of basins where he grew specialized vegetation. This created what's now known as the Emerald Necklace. It's an amazing piece of infrastructure. And not only did it address and solve the flooding and sanitation issues of the city, but it also brought this beautiful green space. It helped clean the water, clean the air, and improve the quality of life of everyone in Boston. This is an example of transformative resilience. So let's go back again to our hotel by the river. Rather than building walls, perhaps we can build elevated walkways that let the water flow underneath. Plant trees to not only reduce the impact of flooding, but also cool down the environment. The guests can enjoy the views, they can feel more connected to the riverine landscape. And in fact, they're not only safer, but they're having a better experience. And perhaps that translates to more revenue for your hotel as well. We really need to stop thinking about resilience purely as the cost of survival. It's also an opportunity for true and meaningful gains. So events like tropical cyclones, like floods, including the flood that we experienced last year, are very daunting. And it is true that with climate change, by and large, these events are becoming more frequent, leading us to a growing risk trajectory. But that trajectory is not faded. We're not just floating passively on a single river headed towards a waterfall. In fact, risk is less like a river and more like a delta. It has innumerable branches. Some of them go towards danger, and some others go towards safety. And yet, perhaps some others go towards not only safety, but thriving. The types of risk models and information that I shared with you today essentially provide us a map of this delta, so we can stop being passengers on this journey of risk and become navigators. We can steer ourselves towards branches that lead not only towards a resilient future, but one that's fair and more beautiful. Thank you.